You also mention in a lot of things, Buckminster Fuller,
Yes.
for people that are not familiar, and the concept of ephemeralization, which is doing more with less. So maybe, can you talk just a little bit about his influence, I guess? We don't have to get too far into it, but I mean, he's one of my biggest influences.
So, I mean, Buckminster Fuller really begins to kick in probably 95. A friend of mine in Chicago has like the entire Bucky library.
Okay.
And has figured out how to do a software engineering practice based on a whole bunch of Bucky's thinking. So it's like, oh, that's interesting. So I kind of absorb a whole bunch of it there, and then begin to move on in. It's hard to express this exactly. So I've always tended to make things. So you kind of absorb the Bucky story, and then the question is, well, what do you do with it? Right.
And then maybe we can transfer it into the Hexayurt and stuff, because that, I'm assuming, plays into some of this.
Well, so this is kind of where the game really gets started, right? You know, prior to the stuff I'm about to describe, I'm still very much a kid and I'm just wandering around trying to find my feet.
Sure.
And then in 96, things really begin to lock on, right? Late 95, 96, that's really when life gets started. So the kind of two formative events there are, I go down and I visit a place called the Farm in Tennessee. And the farm was the apex of 60s civilization. A guy called Stephen Gaskin takes something like 200 school buses of hippies out of the Haight in 71 because they're pretty convinced that the whole Haight-Ashbury culture has become toxic and it's crashing. So they haul everybody out and they drive across country trying to find a nice patch of land to settle down on. And the thing that people forget about the Back to the Land movement is they were expecting a nuclear war. Right?
That's right, yeah, and all that was still very much around.
There was a whole survivalist aspect to the hippie trip that people totally forget. So, you know, they were really going out to start a new civilization somewhere out of a city because they didn't want to get flashed if things went bad.
Right.
So there was a sort of hardcore pragmatic field engineering aspect to all of that. So they go and they sell, and in the course of a few years they move from, you know, school buses to buildings. Some of them are conventionally built houses, some of them are domes.
Right.
And they'd been living in these things for 20 years by the time that I got there. So, and that's, yeah, the farm is a whole other story. They went horrifically bankrupt in the mid-80s. It was...
I'll have to research that then.
Oh, it was rough. And when they went bankrupt, a whole bunch of their people left for California. Many of them got jobs at a place called the Whole Earth Electronic Link, which is then becomes generally known as the Well, which is the place where most of the early cyberculture stuff gets established. Right, that was the first real big culturally significant bulletin board system, because it was where the San Francisco elite, you know, kind of hang out and talk to each other. So that was where early internet culture really got, you know, stabilized and then went mainstream. And a whole bunch of that was farm people. So in any case, I go down to the farm and they completely changed the course of my life in a weekend. So they introduced me to two concepts. Firstly, a guy called Albert Bates, who's still kicking around, runs something called World Watch, says, this is the environment, right? This is the environmental crisis. We are screwed. And this is in 95, maybe 96.
Prophetic.
Well, he just had the data, right? He's like, look, you know, here's our deforestation rate, here's our carbon emission rate, here's the amount of toxic crap we're putting into the ecosystem.
And if you put all these things together, then
here's our trajectory, right? Unless we get massive change, you know, both cultural and engineering practice, this is the inevitable future. And, you know, he's thinking numerically, right? And I'm like, oh, I understand numbers. Oh. And then the other thing is they say, hey, Vinay, can you figure out how to make a geodesic dome with no waste?
So then that's...
And this starts the whole thing. So, you know, once that question's locked in, it's obviously a good idea, right? So I start making my way methodically through all the Buckminster Fuller math, trying to figure out exactly how all of that stuff works, right? Not just how do I build it, but why is it the way that it is? And I spend literally 6 months on this, basically redoing Fuller's work. You know, like, okay, this is where he wound up, this is where he started, how do you get from one to the other? And just kind of in-betweening it so that I actually understand what happened. And at the end of that whole process, I can't do any better than Fuller. I get like a 3 or 4% improvement, but it's totally marginal. It's just not really worth having done. And at that point, I'm stuck. I don't know how to do the next part. Okay, fine. And I go back to software. And then I've been doing software for the next 4 or 5 years. And then, right around 9/11, that's when the next phase begins. I quit software and I go into energy policy. And then I spent basically 12 years doing energy policy and defense.
Right. And then so you also then in 2012, you edited a dense tome called The Future We Deserve, which is a collection of 100 essays from different people across all walks of life. And I'll just do a quote here. Utopia or oblivion, plenty or famine, freedom or slavery. We do not know, but we do know that there is a vital thread of insight which emerges when people think about what they really want, what matters most to them, and how we're all going to live in just a few years. So can you speak more about maybe how that changed since 2012?
So The Future We Deserve was a project that came out of peak Twitter.
Okay.
Right? Twitter had this kind of enormously productive spike right around then, where pretty much the entire early adopter community was on Twitter and basically nobody else.
Right. I mean, I remember those days, even at the very, very beginning. Yes.
And it was amazing, right? Once I got my friends onto Twitter, literally there was a summer, maybe a year even, where I saw twice as much of the people that I liked than I had the previous year, because people would habitually tweet what they were doing, and if it was interesting, you just go tag along.
Right.
And that was an amazing period. And then people discovered that you could tweet hyperlinks.
Oh, yes, and then the sharing of information.
And it went from being Twitter was about the physical world to being Twitter was now about the kind of intellectual world. And at that point, people stopped putting the physical world stuff on Twitter or you couldn't find it. And Twitter became a completely different thing. If Twitter had not enabled the pasting of hyperlinks and it had retained this purely physical aspect, I think it would have been a completely different thing. Right. I think it would have actually changed the world in so much more interesting ways. Somebody ought to do that.
Well, I mean, so then let's keep it on Twitter because you have a very active Twitter presence as of now. So, like, what do you use it most for? I mean, other than hyperlinks, because you do have these kind of not soliloquies, but it's some type of monologues or stream of consciousnesses that you kind of put out.
So, Twitter has recently broken itself, right? This switch to prioritized rather than timeline view.
Oh, yes.
Where it does this algorithmic sort. So Twitter's actual utility to me has dropped through the floor since they made that change. Like to the point where I'm like, oh crap, I need a new medium. So if anybody at Twitter is listening, fix it. Go back to timeline. So Twitter for that period, before they broke it with the timeline change, was where all of the smart people that I could find were, right? And if I ran across smart people that weren't on Twitter, like priority number one, get them on Twitter, that's where the community is. Right. So that kind of soft edge network of 1,000, 3,000, 5,000 people, that was essentially my university, right? That was the place where the other professors were, and the students were, and the culture was, and the game was, and things would go through that like a metabolic structure. Somebody would drag in something new and amazing, and they'd tweet about it, and then a whole bunch of other people would read it, and then they'd do some more research, and then somebody would do some analysis, and there'd be a couple of blog posts. And it was a kind of, I really have astonishingly strong distaste for the term collective intelligence.
I see. Okay.
But what it was a culture, right? And it was a culture that thought for a living.
Right.
And that was Twitter was where that was happening. But again, as you began to see more and more people pile into it and more of the kind of celebrity culture stuff, Twitter begins to round off as a tool for that community because they're being diluted out. And that happens, I've known that would happen to Twitter inevitably for years, because by the time you get to my age, you've seen that happen to 3 or 4 different mediums, right? The diluting out process is a thing that happens over and over again. And you get either diluting out or neglect, and Twitter is basically dying of dilution.
Right, and then but do you think that also has to do something with one of my other big I guess influences is the late Aaron Swartz, and one of his, the founder of Reddit, and one of his things was that before the internet or before a lot of these new kind of things with Twitter, Reddit, is that not everyone had a voice, but now everyone has a voice. But now the question is who gets heard. And then that is kind of the interesting kind of thing, what you were speaking of, like expertise versus culture versus a community. So maybe just talk about more the overall trends of the internet, maybe, because Twitter is one aspect of that. And if you've seen many different iterations, I mean, you've been in it from almost the beginning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's funny how that works, right? So in terms of people online, I got an account in, 91 or something like that. And at the time, we sort of looked at ourselves as being like third generation internet people.
Oh, okay.
It's quite funny. And now we look like first generation internet people, because all the early generations have just gotten smooshed up into, the old days.
Absolutely.
Like, you used it before the web. Yeah, I did use it before the web. But before the web, there was like 5 generations of technology before the web.
Oh, totally.
It's quite weird how it all compresses. So the main thing is that global culture is just sliding into the toilet in the worst possible way right now, and the internet is being dragged right along with it. Right. I mean, the line between the internet and the real world was very, very strong in the 90s.
Oh, absolutely. Like that was when we were growing up. We were talking last night about how we're probably the last generation to then have, I mean, not the last, but like what you were just talking about before the web. Like I remember when we got a modem, and a DSL. I remember that. Like I remember all of that. And then now we start looking at kids that are on TikTok, Snapchat, everything. Like that's all they've learned at such a hyper pace.
They're plugged in from the beginning.
Right, exactly, from the get-go.
Yeah. And I mean, that separation really comes with mobile, right? So,
of course.
When the internet was in your office or in your house, when you were outside, you were offline. There was no internet. You weren't connected.
Very true.
2 worlds, right?
Yep.
Once mobile came along, the tendency of the internet to just fuse into everything as a default state, very, very, very strong. It's like electricity now, right? If you're in a place without data, the place is broken.
Yeah. Because you're not learning anything, no information is being progressed.
Can't find your friends, can't do any work, You're offline. Like if you're in some cellar bar and you don't have mobile signal in there, it's like, whoa, broken, anxiety, what's happening? They should put a repeater in here, right? So it wasn't like that, right?
Okay.
The internet was a direct extension of academic privilege. Pretty much everybody that had an internet account was on a university system or a big government or corporate system where they were getting their internet access directly provided by a hierarchy. So if they did something you didn't like, you complained to the hierarchy and the hierarchy put the hammer on them, right? And that was how the internet ran prior to September 93. Like it was September 93, when AOL built the gateway between the AOL system and the main internet system, and the entire AOL subscriber base piled into the internet. That was the point where we lost accountability, because if you wrote to the AOL admins about the behavior of their users, they didn't do anything because they were being paid by the users, rather than the users being provided with internet as a side effect of a job or an academic role.
Interesting.
And that distinction, where we lost the accountability network around the user, was where the barbarians really got in. Right? Because you went from a position where people had to maintain reasonably civilized standards of behavior, or their administrators yelled at them and threatened to take away their internet, to the point where people could do anything they damn well liked and there was no recourse. So it went from being a highly structured, highly policed, highly civil space with a very, very strong enforcement culture to being literally an anarchy and then a violent anarchy. Right.
And then now, like to do something on Twitter now, you're just yelling into the ether unless you get enough people to get on to the bandwagon of then making someone do something.
So we went from a structured, hierarchical, federated system, right? So the internet's kind of legal system pre-AOL was essentially like America's Old West with sheriffs.
Okay.
Right? I'm the sheriff of, upenn.edu, and none of my users are sending junk mail to your user, and I'm going to make sure of that, right? And it was quite kind of square-jawed system administrators upholding the internet way, because their jobs depended on it.
Right. They had skin in that game.
They had skin in the game. So you had a hierarchical but federated system, and if you were kind of a troublemaker, you could get an account in a place where the system administrators were a little more forgiving and lax. And, but there was always a leash, right? And we look at that as the golden age of the internet without anybody understanding that it was incredibly heavily censored.
Right. Right. Okay.
Right?
Yeah, you have to have that other side of the coin.
You know, there were a lot of things you just couldn't do on the internet because the system administrators couldn't let that happen, because it would, you know, if it didn't get dealt with, it would affect their departments. Right. And if the departments didn't deal with it, it would affect the university. Like, you know, we don't really want to have to cut University of Wisconsin off the internet, but if your users keep doing this, we're going to do it. I mean, that's the kind of stick that people could wave, so they never had to. Right? But, you know, the entire mythology of like early internet anarchy, it's mythology. Right. It seemed that way because nobody was paying attention, but it also seemed that way because the people that were doing the enforcing were hippie weirdos. Right? The system administrators were, generally speaking, not authoritarian, but the system that they were in was authoritarian. In a Vice profile, they profiled you, the man whose job it is to constantly imagine the total collapse of humanity in order to save it. So I don't know how much you take of that, but then in the same piece, in one of the quotes you had, your mission, it's all I do. I get up in the morning, I figure out what to hit, and then I hit it. So how has that kind of your personal philosophy or mission changed over the years? Well, so all this comes out of 2001, right? 2001, the world changes. Of course. And we go from having a 10 years of world peace to being back in the middle of a war which has run pretty much uninterrupted since the first contact between Islam and Christianity. Right. And at that point, we're back in, you know, more than 1,000 years of war, right? You know, we had a brief kind of period where the Christians had kind of won, right? After World War I, Islam is seriously broken, and Christian civilization kind of rocks back on its heels and sits down in the armchair and smokes a cigar and everything's good. And then we've got the whole kind of socialism versus capitalism struggle. Of course. And then, you know, Christian capitalism kind of comes out on top of that. And then we get 10 years of world peace because we essentially have American hegemony because Christian capitalism is held up and everything else has collapsed. Right? And, you know, both of those systems have problems, but at least having a single soul superpower that was, generally speaking, attempting to be benign, maybe falling short, but attempting. Right? Life was pretty good. And then after 9/11, and then the cultural changes that come with 9/11, there's this thing of like, oh, we're sliding off a cliff. And, you know, it was really clear. I remember really as early as Bush versus Gore, you know, when the Supreme Court comes in and decides that Bush is president. Right, Florida. And then and everyone just like poo-poos that or forgets about it or whatever. Man, not me. Yeah, right. I mean, I know it because of research and stuff, but man, that's an interesting story. Oh, my entire subculture, right? All my friends looked at that happen and were like, oh my God, we are screwed. Right? You know, you could just writing on the wall. Yeah, well, because, you know, at that point, it was two completely different visions of the future that were being held out. Right. And once you take the fork in the road, everything else that happens becomes, you know, affected by that fork. It's path dependency. So we'd taken the volatile path, we were on the dangerous track, and then you get a gigantic global crisis, which is 9/11. But the gigantic global crisis that gets handled by people that are fundamentally militaristic. And at that point, it's like lighting a forest fire. You know, 9/11 was the spark, but the tinder, it was already there, laid out, ready to go. It just burns and burns and burns and burns and burns. But because of where I was located culturally, I could see the tinder, right? I could see the enormous heaps of dry brush, and I watched the fire start. I'm like, oh, we are screwed. And then my guru was basically like, look, you know, so far you've been on this track of heading towards being a, you know, kind of professional teacher of meditation when you grow up. I think that's a total waste of time. You should go and do something about the state of the world. Right. Well, then there you go. That's right. And that was really where the load began to shift. So I wind up at Rocky Mountains to, you know, do a bunch of energy policy stuff there. Then I invent the Hexayurt. Right. Then from the Hexayurt, I go to taking a look at how you would use it in US domestic, which turns into the question about evacuating entire cities, which turns into the nuclear work. Once I get my tooth into the nuclear work, you know, what I realize is that I have an unnatural talent for worst case scenario, right? Like, you know, I mean, I worked on stuff that had also been worked on by classified planners. Right. And because none of my work was ever classified, right? I was strictly unclass. But there were areas that I'd worked on which classified planners had also worked on. And it was, consistently that the work that I'd done was vastly superior to work that had been run on classified planners. And I heard that from people in the UK and the US. Because the classified planners are just regular folks that wind up being asked to do worst case scenario planning. Right. And if you don't have a head of titanium, you can't do it. Your mind shuts down because you can't model a scenario in which 2/3 of the people that you know die.